public. And the starting point of this lecture should be quite uncontroversial, and that is that the state plays a fundamental role in economic growth, plays a fundamental role in providing inputs like human capital, physical capital, and institutional capital like contract enforcement and property rights. Now, the next sentence should be equally uncontroversial, but often is something that we don't think about much. And that sentence says that ultimately the effectiveness of these inputs depends on the quality, the talent, the motivation, and the dedication of the people who are hired to provide them. So the best school, the most state-of-the-art equipment in a hospital will be worthless without intelligent surgeons and motivated teachers. So this lecture is about these people and how the state can use incentive schemes to attract, motivate, and retain talented workers for public service delivery. Then why do we need to move away? Why don't we already know everything about incentives from the private sector? I think there's a reason, the main reason why we want to look at the public sector separately is that the type of person that sorts into the public sector is slightly different. And it's slightly different in a way that can interact with the incentives that we offer. So I have to take you back some 60 years ago to the first model of sorting into the labour market, the Roy model, that suggests how workers sort into jobs according to their own preferences and the characteristics of the jobs themselves. For the public sector, this means that we have more workers who have pro-social preferences, because a lot of the tasks in the public sector have positive externality in society as a whole. And at the same time, these workers tend to face low material incentives. And by material incentives, I mean pretty much everything. I can be more precise later, but at this point, let me be as vague as I possibly can. So I mean earnings, performance rewards, also non-monetary recognitions, and so on. At first sight, this seems to be very logical, right? You can think that you can motivate people either by paying them to do what you want them to do, or by selecting the people that already want to do it out of the goodness of their heart or out of their own interest. It doesn't have necessarily to be goodness. It could be any preference for achieving an outcome. And so it makes sense that these pro-social preferences, which make you work hard for a socially beneficial task, and the incentives that you're given to perform these tasks are negatively correlated, because they're doing the same job. Okay? However, the association in the data, the correlation, does not tell us what would happen if we were to offer more high-powered incentive to public sector workers. And in particular, we don't know whether offering larger incentives will motivate these workers to work harder, vis-a-vis would crowd out their other motivation and make them work less. On the extensive margin, we don't know whether providing more high-powered incentives would attract workers not discussed in great detail, but in my opinion is as important as, is that the collaboration facilitates the collection of rich data set. This is the data set that Andrea was pointing out to earlier, that you can squeeze the last drop off, but because also you can collect many drops. That's why you can squeeze them in the first place. The collaboration allows you to collect data, say, on social networks, which organizations normally do not collect. They don't ask workers who they go out for beers with. But if as a researcher you're collaborating with them and you think that that's an important parameter, you can collect that form of information. Of course, we like to focus on the positive, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think we have to keep in mind that there are also disadvantages in this methodology. And the first disadvantage is that you face a very steep trade-off between precision and generality. The closer is the collaboration, the more specific is the setting, the least general potentially your results are. And at one end, you do need this level of precision because it's a collaboration between a set of researchers and one organization, not all the type of organizations around the world. But at the same time, you'd like to do something more general. Of course, the generalizability of the results depends on how the experiment is designed. And if the experiment is designed to disentangle different mechanisms, you might think that those mechanisms might be applied in other settings. There is another long list of problems. The first is policy selection. Typically, no organization in the world will allow you to do something that they have a sense will not work or will hurt their employees. No matter how academically interesting it is, they will not allow you to do it, for good reasons, right? So one thing that I've always been interested in is how people react differently to bonuses versus penalties, which are payoff equivalent. So if you were to solve a game in a game theory class, you should get exactly the same effect. And yet we have a sense that people don't react similarly to these two things. Now, I haven't found a single organization who's willing to experiment with penalties, because they have a sense that they motivate people to grade. So this sort of, I mean, you wonder why a lot of these incentives experiments turn out to be successful, in the sense that incentives increase productivity. You also have to look at the type of incentives that have been tested. They've been tested already with the presumption that they have room for improving matters. So that's the policy selection. There are scalability issues, and this pertains to the fact that normally the field experiments are a very small enterprise. You work with a sector of an organization, or you work with a pilot, so you work only with a few employees. Scalability presents very big challenges, and perhaps the biggest one is that instead of the researcher implementing the policy, it is the organization themselves. And I'll bring you an example later of how the quality and the incentives of the implementation organization itself matters a great deal. And finally, when you go from big to small, or actually from small to big to be more accurate, there are all sorts of effects that don't occur at the micro level when you treat a couple of people, but they do occur at the macro level when you treat an entire population. So for instance, if I work with Firm X, and Firm X is the only one to offer a type of incentive that attracts very clever people, that will be successful for Firm X. But if all the firms in the economy were to offer the same incentive, that incentive won't be as effective anymore, because the pool of clever and talented people is fixed. So the partial equilibrium result that you obtain by experimenting with one firm does not generalize to the scale up in the economy as a whole. But by and large, it's important to have these limits in mind and to try and tackle them in the experimental design. What is dangerous is to forget them and extrapolate at extreme the results of the experiments that you get in one setting to settings which can be profoundly different. So let me come back to leave methodology and come back to the core question of the lecture, which is whether performance rewards improve performance. In a sense, the question is, do they do what it says on the tin? It's called performance reward, you get higher performance as a result. By performance reward, I mean any type of reward, which could be a monetary bonus, a promotion, a non-monetary recognition, a pat in the back, an Employee of the Month award, whatever you can think of, as long as it is tied to a performance measure. And a performance measure is things like sales or test scores, whatever the agent is engaged in. How do they work? Well, you have to have in the back of your mind the basic principles of the principal-agent model. You have an employer, who's the principal, who hires, say, the state, who hires teachers to teach. The state would like teachers to devote effort and passion to the task of teaching. The teacher likes teaching to some extent, but they also like to spend time with their family, they like to go to the movies, they like to read the newspaper in class instead of teaching to these kids who never pay attention to them. This is not autobiographical. So how can the principal convince the agent to put in effort? Well, they can give the agent something that is a reward in exchange for something that the principal themselves want, that is good teaching. The logic is impeccable. Okay? If you give the agent something in exchange for what you want, the agent should do what you want, and everybody goes home happy. So the principle is absolutely impeccable. The problem is in the details, once you go and implement this idea in practice. And you have many challenges, and I'll give you examples of when these challenges were so severe that the incentive schemes failed altogether to deliver the results that it was supposed to deliver. And here is a short preview of what can go wrong. The first is that you can think of performance in an abstract sense, and you have a good sense of what a good teacher does. But then try to quantify this, so to say, if you do X, I pay you Y. Then it becomes a lot more difficult, because what is X? Is it increasing test scores? Is it increasing test scores for the weaker children? Is it improving the behavior of the children? Is it getting them admitted to a good school? You can think of a number of measures. And the issue is that whatever measure you can come up with, you can always find a way to improve the measure without improving overall performance. And there are examples of this happening. A similar concern, you can improve the incentivized dimension at the expenses of others. So we were talking earlier with Danny about incentives for academics. We do research and we do teaching. If you only give me incentives for research, I can work much harder on my papers. But then because I know that I get money out of that, but I get no money out of teaching, I'll end up devoting much less effort to teaching. This is not a problem when both dimensions or the number of dimensions can be all equally measured. But typically, dimensions cannot be all equally measured. So you can quantitatively measure the number of papers that I write, potentially even the journals in which I publish them, but there's no accepted measure of the influence of these papers. No good measures of the influence and the quality of these papers. So you might, by providing incentives on the number, maximize the number at the expense of quality. And that's the multitasking problem, which is highlighted there. And finally, the question that motivated my lecture in the first place, which is that people are not just motivated by money. Not even economists think that anymore. And actually, to be fair, economists have never thought that. But they have thought that the two things are independent. So people are motivated by the respect of their peers, they're motivated by helping others, they're motivated by the happiness of their friends, and a whole host of reasons. To the extent that these are separate from the monetary motivations, you don't need to take them into account in your model, you don't need to take them into account in your empirical design. Right? Because you just look at the effect of the monetary incentives and that gives your answer. The issue is that often these things are interdependent. Right? So the way you pay me sends me a signal about the value of my job for society, for instance. So the way I respond to incentives does not just depend on how much I like money, but it also depends on all the other motivators that drive my behavior. And psychologists have suggested, and now economists have adopted this idea, that a lot of these other motivators can be crowded out by financial incentives. And if that happens, financial incentives can actually backfire. So let me give you some actual evidence. I've promised you evidence, and here it is. Let me start with the positive outlook and the success stories. By and large, performance rewards improve the measure that they reward. Okay? There is a lot of evidence. I'll just bring you two examples here. They're both incentives for teachers, and both in India, actually. Not Lavi is in Israel, but the first one is an incentive for attending classes. This is run in collaboration with an NGO who runs non-formal schools in the state of, I can't remember the state anymore, in an Indian state, it will come back to me. And what happens there is that the teachers forget about not teaching, they just don't show up. So a baseline, they do random inspections of these schools, they find that in over a third of the cases there's no teacher. The teacher is paid to be there, is not there. So that's a simple performance measure to have, right? Presence, attendance, that's a simple one. Even then they have to worry about gaming of the measure. So what they do is that they give a camera to all the teachers, and they tell them, to the teachers in the treatment group, and they tell them, take a picture of yourself with the kids at the beginning of the class at 8 o'clock, and then another one at 1 o'clock, and then we pay you as a function of the number of valid pictures that you send in a month. Now this has marvelous effects. Teachers, once they are paid to show up, when actually their pay depends on them showing up, show up a lot more. And reassuringly, while the incentive is not designed to improve test scores, once they show up, they actually teach. And as a result, you might have thought that this is not a sufficient condition. Being in the class is not a sufficient condition for teaching. You might read your paper, right? But they do actually teach. And so test scores improve, which is the ultimate outcome that we're interested in. A whole set of other papers look at how, having overcome the first problem, that is getting the teachers to show up in class, actually paying them as a function of test scores improves test scores. And the two examples there, so they are from India, from Israel, they show that test scores improve, test score bonuses improve test scores, and they're actually very cost effective. In the Kartik, Muller and Adam paper, they compare giving the same exact amount of money to the school to buy whatever they want, to giving the same amount of money to teachers in incentive pay. And giving the same amount of money to teachers in incentive pay turns out to be a lot more efficient. So these are the good news. The list of failures is a lot longer. And this doesn't count the papers that never see the light of sun because of the publication bias, that zero results are not interesting to journals. Sad but true. The first is a beautiful illustration of the scalability problem. This is exactly the same design, word by word, as the camera experiment for teachers, replicated for nurses in Rajasthan. Actually, the teachers were in Rajasthan too, so it's the same. What do they do? Well, to start with, they work fantastically. The researchers go there, advise the government of Rajasthan how to design this incentive scheme. The government takes on board all the suggestions, they implement it. For the first 2 or 3 months, the nurses take the pictures and show up. Once the researchers leave, however, the system starts failing. Why does it start failing? Because the people who are implementing the payments are the same people who work with the nurses on a day-to-day basis. And so they are much more open to accepting excuses. I forgot the camera ran out of batteries, the dog ate my camera, you know, the typical excuses you can come up with not to show up. And so, as a function of that, they started granting increasingly generous exemptions, and the system became entirely moot. This is exactly the same incentive scheme, which has proven to be very successful when implemented properly. And that gives a beautiful, if sad, example of the issue of scalability. That even in a very similar setting, if the incentives of the people who are implementing the scheme are different, the results of the scheme itself might be different. The second case is a case in which I could have brought many other examples, but because we were talking about teachers' incentives, I kept with that. And that is the typical multitasking story, that you incentivize teachers to improve math test scores. Math test scores go up, but the other test scores either are unchanged or they go down. In order to avoid this type of gaming, this was in Kenya, the state of New York came up with an incredibly complex incentive scheme that was completely game-proof. Unfortunately, it was also incomprehensible. And when incentives are incomprehensible, they're not very effective, because the agents don't understand what it is that they have to do to get these rewards. And this is the paper by Roland Fryer that shows that this very, very sophisticated incentive scheme that adopted in New York schools was too sophisticated for its own good and ended up having no effect. In the long history of horrors, these are two recent working papers. The first looks is a correlation, actually, so I made an exception. There are a few exceptions here, not all of these are experiments. This is a very interesting paper that correlates the managerial practices in Nigerian bureaucracies with the performance in public projects, such as the completion of bridges, the completion of roads, the completion of electrification projects, and so on. And what they find there is that the measure of incentives that they can collect in this survey is actually negatively correlated with outcomes, which is kind of shocking. We can understand incentives being useless, but them being detrimental is kind of worrisome, especially if you're an economist, but should be worrisome in general. So what they found out, digging out a bit more carefully, is that actually the type of incentives that these bureaucrats are given are incentives to comply with process. And these incentives are very common in bureaucracies. You get rewarded or more likely punished for not filling all the right forms, for not putting T stamps, for not ticking all the right boxes, for not doing it in triplicate. Right? And these are exactly the type of incentives that these bureaucrats faced. And bureaucrats who had more of these type of incentives ended up performing worse in the stuff that matters, that is finishing the bridge, finishing the road, making sure that the two sides of the bridge meet in the middle and the like. And it is an example of a multitasking problem. Again, you have finite time, you can either spend your time putting stamps, or you can spend your time with the engineers making sure that the roads are built. And in Nigeria, it seems that this trade-off is alive and well. And the final example brings together the other parts in the picture. In most of these principal agent models, we look at what the principal, the state, the government wants, and what these agents engaged for public service delivery want. And we forget about the final users, okay, which are the people who should benefit from the schools, should benefit from the hospitals, in this case should benefit from tax collection. This is an experiment run with the tax collection agency in Punjab, where they provided the tax collectors a bonus as a function of the amount of revenue. They found that the amount of revenue on average increased, but when they looked more carefully, they found that all this increase was driven by a very small number of properties. These were property taxes, how much you have to pay on your house. So only a very few number of properties increased the tax that they were paying. The others were paying the same, but it's nothing. Digging more carefully and doing surveys, they found out that what the incentive ended up doing was to increase the bribe that the tax collector was charging the citizen in order for the citizen not to pay tax. And the logic is simple. The tax collector, now that he has an incentive scheme, he has more bargaining power because he can say, if you don't pay me, I lose this incentive. For me, they test whether the treatment group, which is the ones that have been given incentives, perform less well on the task because their motivation has been crowded out. Another variant of the test is on the extensive margin, looks at how incentives that are offered to different people before they accept to do the job affect the type and the preferences of the people who sort out into the job. So I will look at two examples of this, starting from the first one, and then afterwards, when we go on to selection, I'll give you another example of crowding out on the extensive margin. This is a paper, this comes from a paper which I recently completed with Nava Shraf and Kelsey Jack. And what we do there is that we work with an NGO who hires agents to sell condoms in Lusaka, which is the capital of Zambia. We measure here, so if you want to have a test of intrinsic motivation, you have to measure intrinsic motivation in the first place. So we ran a contextualized dictator game to measure how much the people who sell the condoms care about HIV. That's the intrinsic motivation for doing the task. How much do I care about HIV should correlate to how much effort I put in the sales of condoms. And then we test whether the incentives that we offer them, which are both monetary and non-monetary, interact with this form of intrinsic motivation. We find two things. The first is that Motivation matters. So people who in the dictator game donate more for the HIV cause, they also put in more effort and sell more condoms. That's reassuring. We have a good measure of motivation. But then once we interact that measure with the incentives, we find exactly the opposite of the prediction of the crowding out hypothesis. We find that the incentives actually leverage this intrinsic motivation, which is surprising, and which makes us think that we need actually more work in settings where perhaps the channels through which the incentive, the motivation crowding out should occur, such as the signaling channel or the reputation channel, are likely to be stronger. What it could be that in our setting these channels are not particularly strong, and so we're finding a positive correlation between these two motivators. It could be that in other settings, and I'll bring an example later, the correlation becomes negative. So what do we make out of all of this? Well, I think we can safely conclude that performance rewards can be effective in cases where good and easy to collect measures of individual performance are available. Unfortunately, this is typically not the case, especially in the public sector. How do you map the effort of a bureaucrat on the completion rate of a bridge? It's pretty difficult. So in these cases, if a good measure of performance is not available, incentives can be either ineffective, and we have plenty of examples, or in some perverse cases, also detrimental. So where do we go from here? Well, one take is to focus on broader motivators. Forget about this thing about measuring precisely quantitatively performance and tying pay to performance. Give something broader, just pay people more in general and tell them just go and do a good job. And that's the efficiency wage strategy. I'll tell you about it in the next slide. Autonomy is even more novel for economists. It's a matter of looking, instead of the way you pay people, at the way you design their job. And the idea in the background is that giving people more autonomy to do their job motivates them because they are at the right state, the success depends on them, and at the same time exploits their superior information about the task. I'll tell you the little that we know about autonomy next. The final issue, and this is what I will conclude my lecture on, is that perhaps we should worry more about getting the right people in, rather than tinkering at the margin with an existing set of people. Maybe the problem is more get the right people in. Once they're in and they stay, they'll do the job properly. But what does it mean right in the public sector? Does it mean talented? Does it mean pro-social? And is there necessarily a trade-off between these two dimensions? So in the final part of the lecture, I'll go to that. Let me just tell you briefly about other motivators, which are efficiency wages and autonomy. Higher wages or efficiency wages are wages which are above the market clearing wage. So a given job for a given characteristic pay X, you offer the same job with the same characteristics and you pay X plus epsilon, where epsilon should be non-negligible. Why should they work? Well, if you think that agents are rational, there's a simple reason for working hard, and the reason for working hard is that you fear losing the job. If the job is better paid than your next best alternative, you're better off working hard on any dimension rather than risking being fired and losing this well-paid job. There is also a more behavioral explanation, which is reciprocity. That is, agents who are paid well are grateful to their employer and perform the tasks that the employer wants them to perform. We don't have field experiments with organizations that look at this in great detail. There is some evidence from the UK, which scares me every time I look at it. It's my colleague John Marina, actually. They looked at differences in pay in hospitals, exploiting the fact that in the UK, as in many other countries, public sector employees have to be paid the same nominal amount regardless of where they live. So in the whole of the UK, nurses in hospitals are paid the same amount. Now, cost of living in the UK varies enormously. So the same amount buys you a great deal if you live in Wales. It buys you nothing if you live in central London. Living in central London and knowing that if I go to a hospital I get cured by a nurse who's paid nothing doesn't reassure me particularly much. But what do they find indeed after you read this paper? They find that the performance of hospitals, measured as in death rates, is much worse in areas where people are paid less. What we don't know is whether this is a selection margin that is they get in people who are less talented because in real terms they're paying them less, or whether these people are demotivated by being paid so little and they don't care about what they do on the job because losing the job doesn't mean a thing for them. Now, clearly this is, for people who are interested in this topic, this is a very interesting topic for research. Autonomy is possibly even more interesting, and actually I should have put the original Weber quotation there, given that I'm giving a Max Weber lecture here. There's a long-lasting rules versus discretion debate in public administration. And this debate has been brought in economics literature more recently. And the idea of the rules versus discretion debate is that the Weber idea is that the bureaucrats maximize their own utility. This bears no resemblance with the utility of the people that they're supposed to serve. So the only way to make them behave is to impose very strict rules that constrain their behavior and make them do whatever it is that you want them to do. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the view that the agents have private information and that if you give them flexibility and autonomy, they can exploit this private information to do the task better. So there is some nascent evidence, this is an oldish paper of mine with Andrea Pratt and Tommaso Valletti, and all the evidence that we have actually points more to the value of discretion, which is not to say that rules are necessarily bad, but maybe in public administrations we are too worried about the opportunistic behavior and we're over-regulating. So this paper that I different wages in different localities. So if you applied from one locality, you get paid 5,000 pesos per month. If you applied from another locality, you get paid 3,750 pesos per month. So a considerable difference in wages. Of course, these wages were not publicly advertised, otherwise everybody would go and apply for the best paid jobs. The job was advertised without mentioning the wage, and then when people would call in to find information about the wage, they would privately receive this information about wages, which depended on their application locality. So they go directly to look at whether there is this trade-off between ability and pro-social preferences. They find that the localities with higher wages attract more applicants, attract higher ability applicants, and do not crowd out publicly motivated applicants. In the end, they increase acceptance rates as well, so it's easier to fill this position. So in this particular setting, there seems to be no trade-off between ability and pro-social motivation. We don't know what happens once these people go on the field, so we don't know whether the people who do it for the money perform better or worse than those who are paid less. Another example, a bit of advertising. This is Erika De Serrano, who's a student of mine who's on the market this year, hence the advertising bit. She has a very fascinating experiment which works with BRAC, which is a large NGO in Uganda. And what BRAC needs to do is to recruit community health promoters. Community health promoters are women who belong to these villages and who are given two tasks. They are given the task to sell medicines and first necessity goods like soap and oil and the like. And then they're tasked with visiting households, especially households with pregnant women, to give advice on antenatal care and postnatal care. What she does is that she can advertise different earnings expectations. She manipulates earnings expectations, so she advertises different level of earnings in different villages. And the different level of earnings vary enormously, from 7,000 shillings to 200,000 shillings. You don't need to know how much a shilling is worth, also because I don't remember it. But the ratio is 7,000 to 200,000, so it's a very large variation in earnings. And what she finds there, which is very fascinating, is that she measures the effect that different earnings have on the perception of the job. She finds that agents who are offered the high earnings job thinks that the job is mostly about sales. She finds that paying a lot of money attracts agents who like sales, but most importantly, discourages agents who have pro-social motivation. And in the end, this reduces retention rates, because the agents who come in for the money, if they find out that they don't make quite as much money as they would have wished, they drop off quite soon. Whereas the agents who have signed up to help the pregnant women, they were not expecting to make much money in the first place, they were more pro-socially motivated, they stay longer. So this is a setting in which the results are consistent with crowding out on the selection margin. Which should make you wonder, how does this make sense in light of the previous result? Well, notice that this is a setting in which incentives have the best shot at providing a signal about the job. These jobs were never advertised in these communities. People had no idea what the job was about. They were told these jobs is about two things: selling products and helping pregnant women. The incentive in this setting can offer a very precise signal about the nature of the job. In the previous example, the nature of the job was very clear. There was no ambiguity that it was an administration job to administer transfers from an anti-poverty program. So there was no scope for incentives to act as a signal. But here we have evidence that when there is scope for incentives to act as a signal, they can do so. And they can actually crowd out one specific type of person. So this, the final paper that I review is another paper which I do with Nama Shraff and another co-author whose name is Scott Lee. And our final goal in this paper is to take it from where Finan and co-authors had left it, the co-authors had left it, that is to see whether this differential selection actually affects performance. Because ultimately that's what we care about. Does it make a difference for the type of people you select? Does it make a difference on how they perform? And we run this, it's a nationwide field experiment, which is run in collaboration with the government of Zambia in the context of the new Community Health Assistance Program. The aim is to test how the career incentives affect who self-select into the job, like the BOPE, but then to follow them once they go working and accept how and analyze how the incentive affect their performance through the selection margin. At this point, you have to wonder how on earth we can even hope to separate the selection effect from the effort effect. Because if you offer career incentives, this is, yes, it's going to attract different people, but it's also going to affect their behavior once they're on the field. And I only want to identify the first part of this effect. I'm only interested in measuring the selection effect. Here, like in Erica's paper, we exploit the fact that this is an entirely new job. It's the first time that the Ministry of Health is advertising this position. And so the attributes of the job are unknown to the applicants. So what can we do is to change the type of incentives at the application stage. So when we advertise the job in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, we change the salience of career incentives in different localities. But then once people get selected and they start working, they're all offered exactly the same incentives. So the first aspect opens up the selection channel. People respond to different ads so they can select themselves differently. The second aspect, in contrast, shuts down the effort channel because people both in treatment and in the control group are given exactly the same incentives. Let me tell you something about the context so that I'll go more into detail in this paper than I had previously done, but I figured I should show you one field experiment up close. So the context is one in which there are very severe staff shortages. Typical case sub-Saharan Africa is that you have villages in the middle of nowhere where there are no doctors and no nurses. The government appoints a doctor, sends them out there. The doctor sees the village, runs out. And this happens continuously. So most, and the nurses, they do the same thing. As soon as they have a qualification that they can use, either in the capital city or even preferably outside the country, they run away as fast as they possibly can. So this program is actually predicated on a different model, which is the model that many NGO uses, like BRAC. Instead of taking nurses who are used to the urban life and sending them to rural villages, take community people, people who live in the community, have lived in the community all their life, and train them, and then send them back in the hope that they're sufficiently attached to the community to remain there even after they've received the training. Now, so this program is supposed to address these shortages by formalizing these community health workers' positions, which are run by NGOs. The government said if it works for NGOs, it might work for us as well. So let's make this a new cadre of the Ministry of Health, the community health assistant. The problem with them is that they work in remote areas, and so challenges in monitoring and performance measurement rule out completely performance-related pay. There's no way you can know what people do. We know because we're the researchers in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, and we spend a fair amount of resources to measure what it is that they're doing, but in practice the Ministry of Health would never be able to do that. So career advancement, that is salary progression within the civil service, can but does not have to be used as an incentive. You could design this program in two ways. One is a standalone job. You become a community health assistant. This is your job, to work in the community, taking care of the community. Or you can design it as part of the hierarchy of the Ministry of Health. You are a community health assistant today, but you can then go to nursing school, you can then become a clinical officer, you can become a doctor. So the Ministry of Health themselves were really in two minds whether this was a good idea. We met with the HR director of the Ministry of Health in 2010 when they were launching the program, and he himself asked a question that could be in a Benabou and Tirol paper. He asked us explicitly, what will happen now that they see themselves as civil servants? Will they retain their connection with the community, which is what we are hiring them for in the first place? So we thought this was a wonderful situation in which the question that the organization wanted an answer to was also a question that was of great interest for researchers. So we set up together an experiment to answer precisely that question. So the experimental design, this is the first phase of the Community Health Assistant program. They were recruiting 2 community health assistants from 165 communities in 48 districts. And as I told you, what we did already in the experiment was to vary the salience of career and social benefits. And I'll show you how we did that. These are the posters that were distributed in these communities. Sorry, you can't read the small print, but I can tell you what it says. And we basically, it's a spot the difference kind of exercise to see at this time whether you're still awake. The left-hand side poster is the control poster. We advertise the job as a community save your job? Do you want to serve your community? Are you motivated by helping people? Come and apply for this position. The right-hand side poster there is the career salience poster, is the treatment poster, where the job is advertised as something completely different. The motivation for doing this job is the same, but the motivation is to boost your career. Now, everything else under qualifications, application methods, closing date is identical in the two. The list of benefits up here is different, okay? And it's different so to be consistent with the main black box. So in the control poster, you can see it bigger there, maybe, yeah, you can read it out. The benefits are all about be a good community member, help your friends and neighbors, help your family, learn what you can do to help your community. In the treatment poster, we make it explicit that the benefits of applying for this post and doing this job is that you can actually do something else afterwards. So become a highly trained member of the healthcare system, access future career opportunities, including clinical office, nurse, environmental health technology. And the career advancement comes with a very large salary increase. Community health assistants are paid $290 per month. These are US dollars. The nurses entry level is $530. The environmental health assistant is $615, and the doctors. Okay, so the idea is really to make salient the different aspects of the job at the application stage. We randomize this at the district level across the country to minimize spillovers. So we have 48 districts, 24 in treatment, 25 in control. We stratified by province and rate of high school attainment because a requirement for the job was grade 12 education. So we want to make sure that the provinces that the districts are balanced on that measure. And we have a balanced sample in the end. The applicants come from similar areas and we'll end up working in similar areas. That's Zambia. Okay, and the dots, the measle dots, are all the communities where we do this. Actually, it's not a GPS map, this one. They're just dots to give you, but the districts are not one. And by the way, the white districts are not in the program because they are not rural. Well, not rural enough by Zambian standards. They're simply rural. Okay, so what do we find? Very quickly on the applicant pool, very similar to what Dalboy co-authors found. We found that the career incentives drew in candidates with higher skills, candidates who put larger weight on career versus social benefits, and they're similar on a host of other dimensions, including pro-social preferences. So if you imagine we have a battery of pro-social preferences tests, they behave identically in the two treatments. But if you ask them to choose between career prospects and social benefits, they tell you that they like the career more. Let me get to the core of the paper, that is to try and assess what's the effect of this treatment, the selection, on their performance. First, I have to tell you what they need to do. They have three tasks. The primary task is to visit households in their catchment area and provide health advice and refer sick members to the nearest health clinic. Again, they have to focus on pregnant women and young children. Secondary task is to assist the staff at the health post to dispense medicines, help with antenatal care, and maintain the facilities. And the other secondary task is to organize community mobilization meetings. These are meetings in which they call the entire village and they explain the benefits of testing for HIV, of immunizing the children, so on and so forth. I have to tell you something about the context to understand what this job really entails. They work in very remote, low-density areas. The median area is 80 square kilometers, and it has 200 households. To give you a sense, 80 square kilometers is the size of Manhattan. So imagine Manhattan with 200 families in it. House prices will probably be lower. Anyway. To make things more complicated, the roads are really, really bad. And this is one of the few cases where I actually show pictures of the context. They have to walk on roads like this. This is after the rain. There is only a little branch where they can walk. Or you have little paths like that, where you can only either walk or use bicycles. So clearly a lot of effort is needed to visit these households. So how do we measure performance? Well, in Zambia, everything you do requires a receipt. Everywhere you go, they give you a receipt. And the CHAs are no exception to this fact. So the Ministry of Health gives them a receipt book, and every household that they visit, they have to fill in the start time, the end time, the name of the household, the phone number of the household, and then they have to collect a signature. Now, they collect this, it's done in triple copy, like every good bureaucracy. They give one copy to the household and they keep the rest of the copies for themselves. And eventually they send them to the Ministry of Health. Of course, we researchers engaged in field experiments are very patient, and we realize that it takes time to get the performance measure that we need. But probably this will take until 2020 to get hold of these books. So we did a shortcut. We implemented a parallel SMS reporting system, implemented on behalf of the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health gave every community health assistant a phone and told them that every time they issue a receipt, they have to send a text message with exactly the same information as in the receipt. And a fraction of these text messages are audited for control, for quality purposes. We have those data. So they come in real time. Every time a child visits a household, we get the text message, it goes to our computer.
How do you get the signature?
We don't get the signature in the text message.
Well, here you would have it, so how do you know?
Oh, we will eventually have it. We will eventually have the booklets.
No, but what prevents the person from
The audits. The audits. There are phone call audits. And they have, importantly, they don't have any incentive to visit more households. They don't get to earn more. They don't get any promotion. Nothing says that you'll be rewarded for visiting more households. So it's a risk without any apparent benefit. We have a parallel system that we can use, and this is filled in by the people that staff the health post in the health management and information system, which is the way the Ministry of Health collects information. And they collect also information on household visits. So we have these two parallel systems that we can use and check for discrepancies. So what do we find? We find the career incentives, and this is probably surprising, it was at least surprising to the ministry. They attract agents who do 30% more visits. This is the receipt data from the SMSs. I'll show you the other ones afterwards. What does it mean in terms of quantity? It means that in the space of, this is over 18 months, they would have visited about 14,000 more households had they been on the career incentive scheme. Interestingly, the selection on observables, so the difference between those two columns is that this column has no observable, and this has all the observables, so ability plus social preferences and the like. The difference in observables explains a bit, but it only explains 15% of the effect. So most of this is being driven by selection on unobservables. These people are just more hardworking. And the reason why this is important is that one way of improving the selection process is to put in more requirements, to try and spot what characteristics make a public servant effectively, and then select only those with those characteristics. There were selection panels who chose these agents, and they did all their best to reduce the difference on observables. But that's of no use if most of the difference in behavior is driven by unobservables. Now, in the interest of time, I just flash these results. They do twice as many meetings, that's their second task, so it's not a matter of multitasking. And they see the same number of patients are health posts. The effect is positive, but it's not precisely estimated. This is very important because this is what motivated the ministry in the first place. After 1 year, they're all equally likely to be still in their post. 80% of them are there, and this doesn't differ between the career and the career treatment and the control group. Of course, we are concerned about a number of things, which I'm sure Andrea would love to hear me talk about, but in the interest of time, I'll skip all these checks, and I can discuss them later if there are questions. These are all the compensating factors that we look at, and we find no evidence for any of them. Sorry if I'm flashing this, but again, I'll be happy to come back and talk about it into more details. So what do we find in the end? We find a very strong selection effect on performance. Career incentives attract candidates who perform better and are equally likely to be retained. The performance effect is largely driven by different unobservables, which points out the importance of giving the right incentives when you advertise the positions, because that allows people to sort in the right way. And again, looking back at the crowding out hypothesis, the two main sources of motivation that attract applicants to these jobs, which are the material benefits in career prospects and the intrinsic utility due to helping the community, do not clash. So what have we learned if I have to bring everything together from all that I've been trying to tell you in this hour or so? Well, we clearly have made some progress in understanding how to attract, motivate, and retain agents in public service delivery. But I wouldn't be here if we had all the answers already. I think much remains to be discovered, and especially what I'm particularly interested in, I think are particularly interesting questions, are the debate between rules and autonomy. What happens if you give more autonomy? Does it empower agents, or is it like signing a blank check to allow them to take home even more money than they're already taking home to start with? And then the final question, which I think deserves most scrutiny, is how to harness pro-social preferences. I think we've been worried too much about rounding out pro-social preferences, and we haven't thought about the positive aspect of the question, which is how can you leverage these preferences that people have? So I think these are interesting questions that await further